Good morning, everyone. We're going to get ready to get started. Here are our Zoom meeting preparations. Just a reminder that your phones and computer should be muted to minimize any background noise. Make sure that you've turned off your camera to prevent any bandwidth issues that could occur. And if you have any questions, be sure to drop those questions into the chat at the bottom of your screen. And if you require an interpreter or any assistance in terms of accessibility for future LDOE meetings, you can contact LDOE Communications at la.gov. So we're moving into session 7 of our leader series, and it's hard to believe that we've made it to session 7, but our series has been titled Leading Professional Development, Leading the Charge for Evidence-Based Literacy Practices. And this session is on implementing explicit literacy interventions and extensions based on student needs. I am Katasha Edwards. If you're new to our series, a PD specialist for leaders here at the department and an educator of 20 plus years. So we're excited to be here with you today. This is just some information about our Science of Reading implementation office hours. We kicked them off last Friday and we had them from 10:30 to 11. So we will be hosting them each week. Currently the time is 10:30 to 11. And this is time for teachers, leaders, district personnel, anyone that has questions about implementation around the science of reading, just to jump on. We do some fun facts associated to the science of reading, along with some questions that may have come up in some of our sessions. We've answered some of those questions, as well as just opening up the chat to allow people to ask questions that they may have. So if you have time or if you have questions, be sure to hop on our office hours. And I think we're going to have someone drop the link and the password to the office hours into the chat. So we're going to move in to today's session focus. This session will focus on some key considerations around implementing explicit literacy interventions based on school, student, and district needs. We're going to look at the importance of using valid and reliable assessment data, that making sure that there's some alignment to our foundational reading skills and curriculum, scheduling, staffing, ongoing PD, communication, and space, just to name a few things. So before we jump into looking at our interventions, I thought that this was, just worth a few minutes of our time to look at. This is Louisiana's fall 2020 reading report. This report was, released based on the fall 2020 data. And if you're interested in looking at this report in its entirety, it will be linked in this presentation. And this presentation, along with all of our presentations, are available in the literacy library. This will be loaded within a few days. So if you want to look at that report in depth a little bit later, it is available there for you. And if we were in a face-to-face session today, or a Zoom platform that allowed for us to just kind of do a turn, this would be an opportunity for us to do a turn and talk. So instead of, I'm just going to allow you to look at this data just for a moment and just to think about, what are your initial thoughts when looking at our pre-K to third grade data over the last 3 years and looking at proficiency levels, looking at the percent of students that are on or above grade level. So, if we look at this data, at a glance, I'm sure that, there's some questions that you may have, but just looking at overall proficiency across all three grade levels between 2018, 2019, and 2020. If we're looking at percentage of students that are scoring on and above grade level in 2018, we were at about 57% as a state across all three grade bands. And then we move into 2019, and we're looking across all three grade bands. We were had a decline to where we were at about 51%. And then we look at the fall of 2020 data, and we were at about 45%. So we see that, you know, there were some significant declines as a result of the pandemic. But if we look at that trend data even prior to the pandemic, there were some declines yearly when looking at our literacy data. So I think that was worth us looking at when we're thinking of in terms of interventions that may be necessary, because based on our fall 2020 reading data, we were looking at only about 45% of our students across those three grade bands who were on or above grade level. And even just to think about, I know we're talking about intervention, but I think that sometimes the best intervention can be prevention. So this is the ladder of reading, and I'm sure that many of you probably have seen this infographic before. It was created by Nancy Young in 2012, and she updated it in 2017. And she really is a leader when looking at students with dyslexia and practices aligned to structure reading and how they can support not only students with reading difficulties, but looking at supporting all students. So if you look at the reading ladder, we see here that about 5% of students learn to read seemingly effortlessly. And then about 35% of students learn to read relatively easy with broad instruction. So that's about 40% of our student populations. And this is based on copious amounts of research, that about 40% of our students learn, you know, pretty easily with any type of broad instruction. But then when we look at the next rung on that ladder, about 40 to 50% of our students, when learning to read proficiently, they require code-based, explicit, systematic, and sequential instruction. 40 to 50% of our students. And then if you look at that last rung, and this is like in terms of students with in need of special support. Here, she has called out, you know, students with dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia, where learning to read requires code-based, explicit, systematic, sequential, diagnostic instruction with many repetitions. So we're looking at about 60% of our student population require some very explicit, systematic, code-based instruction in order to be proficient. So when you glance back at our fall 2020 reading data, we see here that one of our big takeaways was in the fall of 2020, we had about 45% of our students who were reading on or above level. So, you know, we were close to that 60% of students who were below level based on our fall 2020 reading data. And when we look here, we look at the importance of a structured literacy approach. So it really makes me think about, like, when thinking of in terms of our reading implementation across the state and our structured reading approach, how many of those students who were below level actually received instruction that was systematic, code-based, explicit, aligned to the science of reading. So I know we're moving into intervention, but just in thinking of terms of prevention, we know that instruction based on the science of reading will support students who would not typically learn to read with other forms of instruction. So now we're going to look at our literacy intervention guidance. There is a K-2 literacy intervention guidance document on our literacy library, but we're going to start here with our pillars, because when we began this journey of going through this series of leader PDs, we knew that our buckets were going to be the pillar. So this is the pillar that's aligned to intervention and explicit instruction. It just says that the Louisiana Department of Education Literacy Division believes that literacy outcomes will improve when students are provided with high quality core instruction together with explicit literacy interventions and extensions based on student needs. So we're going to walk through that intervention guidance document as we walk through today. But if you want to have that one pager that you can utilize with your leadership team or your teachers, that one pager is available for you to print and share from the literacy library. So we've looked at our trend data over the last 3 years. We've looked at the importance of a structured literacy reading approach to be able to support all students. So now let's talk about the urgency of literacy interventions and really why time is key. We know that students who fail to meet reading benchmarks by 3rd grade usually begin to struggle in more and more areas of school. We know that without the benefit of effective literacy intervention, these students will eventually face a higher likelihood of dropping out of school. And if these students do go on to college and career, that the effect of that lost classroom time has a lasting effect even into career with diminishing opportunities for these students. And when thinking of terms of the number of students across the state of Louisiana who go to college and they are spending their freshman year taking a lot of remediation courses because of deficits that they bring into college. So that is another reason why there is a priority to providing these foundational reading interventions with our K2, K3 students, even our elementary and middle school students, so that when students reach college, that they are equipped with the skills that they need. The last thing that we have here is that the more a student falls behind, the more time the student likely will need to catch up. So this places an urgency on identifying struggling readers as soon as clues of lapsing begin to reveal themselves. So who should receive literacy interventions? Because in terms of today, we're talking about our literacy interventions. Targeted literacy interventions should be provided to students who demonstrate weaknesses in any areas of reading. These are the areas of phonemic awareness. Are they able to identify and manipulate those individual phonemes or those individual sounds in spoken words? Students who demonstrate weakness in phonics, which is the connection between the sounds and the letter symbols. Students who have fluency deficiencies. Is the reader able to read with speed, accuracy, and expression? Students who demonstrate weaknesses in vocabulary, which is the knowledge of words and their definitions and context. And students who just demonstrate comprehension, is the understanding of meaning of text. Are students demonstrating weaknesses in these areas? Students who demonstrate weakness in any of these areas should receive interventions. So on our intervention implementation guidance document, there are some best practices around interventions that are outlined. So one of the initial best practices is to screen all students for potential reading problems at the beginning of the year. So when you do your early literacy screener, we should screen all students in K through 3 with that early literacy screener. But your students in 4, 5, middle school, those LEAP 360 diagnostics, those are also some screeners that you can give at the beginning of the year to identify students who have potential reading problems. You're going to also utilize your diagnostics that are within your Tier 1 curriculum as a process of identifying students with potential reading problems and grouping them and tiering them for interventions. We're going to monitor and progress our students at the middle of the year, as well as the end of the year, so that we have data to show growth, or are those students still in need for additional supports. So teachers and leaders can look at the pre-K to third grade assessment guidance document, and it's linked in this presentation for information about our early literacy screeners. And then based on our screening, we're going to provide intensive, systematic instruction on foundational reading skills in small groups to students who score below benchmark on the universal screener and or the diagnostic provided by the Tier 1 curriculum. So what are some structures that should be in place as you think about interventions moving into the school year? And, for the last few weeks, I feel like, we were at the pregame show. If we were in a sports event, so that pregame show is wrapping up with, our planning. So when planning and we're getting ready for kickoff. So as you kick off your school year and you're thinking about the structures that you should have in place to begin those explicit systematic interventions, they should be done in small groups. And these small groups should meet between 3 to 5 times per week for about 20 to 40 minutes. We should be sure that our targeted interventions or our intervention instructions target the specific skills in which students show a deficit. And within those interventions, we should provide opportunities for guided, independent, and feedback. There should be guided practice, independent practice, and feedback. And at a minimum, we should progress monitor our Tier 2 and 3 students at least once a month. And when thinking about the power of your screeners when preparing for your interventions, I know that, if we were doing just a compliance structure with our early literacy screeners, there are only like certain measures that you have to give to report to the state. But when thinking of looking at that whole child and really being able to drill down to their ability and their possibility of exhibiting reading difficulties, we want to make sure that we administer all measures for that student that are required at each grade level, and that we look at that data and that we're looking at that data at the begin, mid, and end of year so that we can really see the effectiveness of our interventions. So here are some key components of those interventions. We talked about structures, making sure that there's direct, explicit instruction and that they're systematic, that we're giving immediate feedback to our students when we're working with them, and that they are aligned to the specific needs of the students. But here, I think the key component that we need to be looking at is that they're driven by data. So how does data collection drive our interventions? We know that by collecting adequate data, we're able to determine the risk or the need for the intervention. We're able to determine the skills to target. We're able to progress monitor, because progress monitoring is data collection. And based on our progress monitoring and our assessment of the benchmarks in between and those actual benchmarks, we're able to measure the effectiveness of our interventions. So here are some additional considerations when you're getting ready to set up your interventions for this school year. The first thing you want to think about are your curriculum supports. What supports for intervention are available in your foundation's curriculum? I know, if you're in using CKLA, you have your remediation and assessment guides, and EL and ARC. All of these are our foundational tier 1 curriculums. They all have some supports within those curriculums that support interventions. So we want to make sure that we're not utilizing a random teachers pay teachers worksheet or a random workbook for intervention, but that we're aligning it to our curriculum supports and that we're aligning it to those specific skills that our students need. And then the next consideration that you want to think about is you want to think about your schedules. When crafting your schedules as leaders, and if you are the school building level leader or if you're a literacy interventionist and you're supporting like creating those school-wide literacy schedules, there should be carved out time for each grade level, each content, to have interventions and extensions, because we don't want to just intervene. We want to extend for those students who are ready to go beyond. The next consideration is your interventionists. Like, who are the people providing interventions to your students? And I know as a building level experience administrator, I know that we used everyone in the building to support instruction. And even as my time as an assistant principal, we utilize everyone within the building to support instruction because we are all reading teachers. But we can't expect for everyone to have the same level of expertise when it comes to literacy interventions. So there's definitely some training and professional development that will need to take place when thinking about who your interventionists are. What resources are you going to have to support those interventionists? What materials and what supports? And what do your interventionists look like? Are they pushing into the classroom? Are they pulling out of the classroom? Do you have a clearly identified place for these interventions to take place? So those are some things that when you're thinking about interventions that should really just be priority as we get ready to jump off into the school year. And then the next thing that should be a consideration when setting up interventions is, what are your data collection and progress monitoring processes? What procedures are you utilizing within your school or your school system to document these interventions and be able to say, these are our procedures and processes aligned to data collection, but also aligned to interventions? And then, what are the purpose of the interventions that are taking place? When interventionists pull students, they shouldn't just be pulling students because, okay, this student is identified as having difficulty. There should be a clearly defined purpose aligned to specific skill deficits to support those students within those interventions. So now, we've really been taking some time during each of our leader sessions to kind of do a science of reading spotlight. So if you have had an opportunity to jump into some of the teacher sessions, and they're all available in the literacy library, Sarah has really taken our teachers through our language comprehension strands and our word comprehension strands, and really talked about what instruction looks like and what student learning looks like within each of those strands. So it would be a great opportunity as you set up your time with your teachers and their PLCs with back to school to make sure that you can jump into those sessions. But for the purpose of today, we're going to look at Scarborough's reading rope, because we know that when we intertwine those strands together, that is how students become skilled readers. But I also want you to think back to this scenario that we shared maybe 2 sessions ago. You go into your PLCs, and one of the questions is, why are my students struggling with comprehension? And when thinking of terms of our reading rope and those different strands, these are some of the questions that or answers to why some of the students may be struggling. Do they have, effective strategies to help them understand, organize, and remember information? Do they have adequate knowledge of word meaning, those vocabulary strands? Do they have the ability to read fluently enough to understand and remember what they're reading? Do they have the ability to accurately decode the words, and or is it tied to interest or motivation? So we've looked at Scarborough's reading rote. Let's look back at the simple view of reading, because the simple view of reading outlines that definition where we look at decoding and language comprehension and how they equally impact students' reading comprehension. So when we go back and look at this conceptual model, it reminds us of the importance of good language comprehension and good word level reading skills to become a good reader. But in terms of interventions, when we're looking at this model, we know that our tier 2 and our tier 3 interventions should focus on addressing the specific components that are comprising the students' reading difficulties. So if through assessment, you know that a student is having difficulty in the area of decoding, then their tier 2 and tier 3 interventions should be focused primarily in that area, versus the language comprehension strands, if it is discovered through assessment, screening, and diagnostic that students are having difficulty in the language comprehension area, then their tier 2 and tier 3 interventions should focus on addressing the specific components of those strands. So we want to talk about supporting students where they are. Interventions should begin with the supports provided from your foundation's curriculum. I think we said that a lot of times today, but that's just very important, that that is where your interventions should begin. But if you are thinking, you know, what is an additional resource? And we kind of looked at this resource 2 sessions ago, but we're going to look at it again just for a couple of minutes today, because the AIM Institute Quick Guide for Reading Assessment is a great resource for teachers to have in hand to support students with identifying next steps and planning interventions for students. So here's the quick guide for reading assessment. And we walked through just this first page during a previous session, but it really takes teachers through, like, what are their next steps when trying to identify where reading difficulties are, and what should that instruction look like to support those students? So when crafting those interventions for students who have difficulties in a certain area, what should that include? And this guide really walks you through looking at, you know, if a student has reading comprehension as an area of weakness, then there's some questions that you should ask. And then there's some next steps based on that question. So if the student is weak with reading comprehension, then you're gonna initially think of, you know, the oral reading fluency, and there's some assessment with oral reading fluency that would need to happen. So if they're strong with their reading fluency, the teacher knows that that intervention can focus on vocabulary and text comprehension skills. But if they were weak in fluency, then you would need to dig a little bit deeper and then assess, you know, the word recognition skills or your oral reading fluency. And if they're strong here, we know that those interventions could focus on fluency skills and emphasizing expression and phrasing. But if they're weak here, we're going to dig a little bit deeper, and we're going to need to go in and assess our students on decoding and phonics skills. So if they are weak in decoding and phonics skills, then we're going to move to phonemic awareness skills. But if they are strong in those phonemic awareness skills, you're going to go back and you're going to craft those interventions based on instruction and decoding and phonics skills. And then if they're weak with your phonemic awareness skills, then you're going to focus instruction on developing phonemic awareness. So this decision flow chart also helps if, you know, you receive your DIBELS or your early Acadience learning, your early literacy screening data, and your teacher wants to know, well, then, you know, what next? You know, what should I focus on within those interventions? You know, if they were below benchmark in letter naming fluency, this flow chart gives you like how to focus on accuracy, and how to focus on automaticity, and what the instruction or intervention looks like based on this. And also, just to know that this chart was provided to us through AIM. I did attend one of those virtual sessions, and it will be posted in the literacy library. So also here, it walks you through phoneme segmentation fluency, what should happen. So I think this is just a really good resource that you can make sure that your teachers have in hand to support developing those foundational literacy screening tools. So just before we end, we have just a couple of more things. We're going to go back to our presentation here. Just a little bit of reflection. When thinking of terms of interventions and extensions, are interventions and extensions currently a part of your daily schedules? What professional development opportunities do you have to support interventionists with effective literacy interventions aligned to the science of reading? I think this is a big one as you reflect. And also, what additional supporting resources are available in your foundations of reading curriculum? So I think this would be just an amazing time to spend a little bit of time with your literacy team, with your instructional specialists, with your leadership team, really digging into your Tier 1 curriculum and just really being sure that you know those additional supporting resources that are aligned within your curriculum to support interventions and extensions. Last but not least, the session feedback is really, really important. So if you have just a couple minutes and someone's going to drop the link to the chat in the chat for this, make sure you take a few minutes to do the session feedback, to give feedback, because we really want to think about what are our next steps in our PD series. We really have some exciting topics that Sarah and I are already working on. We're looking at writing, because I know that it is a hot topic when preparing instruction aligned to the science of reading. And we're looking at some of the other feedback that you guys have given in those feedback forms. So be sure that you call out any literacy, science of reading, any professional development opportunities that would support you with supporting the teachers in your school or your district. Also, one other thing, if you tweet, we really want to keep the conversations going around literacy. And there's just some really amazing things happening across the state right now with literacy. So if you tweet, be sure to use the hashtags Louisiana Literacy or hashtag Reading Revival when you tweet, because we really want to know some of those amazing things that are going on with literacy. If you have any questions, you can contact me. I'm katasha.edwards@la.gov, or you can contact Louisiana Literacy at la.gov with any questions or suggestions. I really want to thank you for attending today's session. I know that we are just a little bit past time, but please know that the department appreciates your literacy leadership. Be sure, she just did an amazing session on setting up your classroom. So she has 2 additional sessions next week. I know that she has one on assessment, and I have one additional session that's going to be on Monday of next week, and it's on culturally responsive classroom. So I'm really excited about that session. So if you have time, you can pop into that one. And we really just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your leadership, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.